Dank u wel. I'm afraid I don't know if I have an inspirational story to tell. I used to be consulted by my friends. I was an expert when they had very young children in putting them to sleep when nobody else could do this. I was called, emergency calls. My child will not stop crying, so get James. And after 2 or 3 minutes, they would go to sleep. So be forewarned. And I'm not going to tell, as I said, an inspirational story. I want to do 2 things. I want to talk about a dilemma that I think the entire cultural and museum world is facing, perhaps the whole world, because it's very much related to the massive information we have that we are struggling to turn into information. We're facing a kind of almost social obesity with all this low-calorie, low-value information, and we're not able to turn it into something that's making us fit. It's making us sluggish, and in some senses, it's highly unhealthy. So I'm going to talk a bit. My problem inserts itself in this much bigger problem in which I'm trying to do something. So I'm going to talk about a problem that museums face and a misunderstanding about what I think museums are. And I'm going to show you the last of 5 major institutional transformations that I've had the privilege of being part of. When people ask me what I do for a living, I often say, well, I'm just a gardener. In my deepest past, perhaps I was a flower, but now I'm not the flower, I'm just a gardener. And so I've been struggling in the last 30 years to transform institutions with people. So I'm going to be telling you a story about the institution that I currently direct, which is Italy's 2nd most important art museum. Now, whoops, we don't have my slide. There we go. Because I want to start with what I believe a museum is, and I'm going to give you 3 sort of sound bites, 3 quotes. One is from Nelson Goodman, who said in 1980 that a museum is an institution for the prevention of blindness. And we prevent blindness by making works work. And if you read through that quote, this is an incredibly activist quote about what museum going is about. Because we participate in the making and remaking of our worlds. Frank Oppenheimer, the director of the San Francisco Exploratorium, the world's first interactive science center, just said, well, nobody ever failed a museum, which captures the other specificity about museums. It's not school. We don't have exams. Nobody asks you when you buy a ticket. Before you go in, we just like to ask 5 questions. You see if you get 3 out of 5, you're allowed in the museum. We don't do that. Museums aren't for that. And finally, to link with the speaker this morning about learning, Loris Malaguzzi, the great inspirer of the Reggio Emilia schools, said that learning is more than teaching. Learning is not, the quality of the teaching is not the learning. It's creating the conditions for learning. So let's keep all that in our minds as we face my big dilemma. My big dilemma is actually what Nellik was saying. We have falling attendance museums, notwithstanding the dilemma I'm going to talk about, which is too many visitors. The overall trend, even to today, in attendance to permanent collections is falling slowly because people go when they're a school kid, and they go then when they become a parent, and they take their kid, and they go as a grandparent when the parents want a day off. They go 3 times in a lifetime because, well, I've seen the museum. Right, you've seen it. When? 15 years ago, I came as you have this sense that museums don't change. So this is an existing problem we have. Now, in the 60s, Thomas Hoving came up with a brilliant idea, which actually was his idea to try to get people back to his permanent collections at the Metropolitan. In 1966, he took the treasures from Florence that had been threatened by the floods. They couldn't put them in the museums. The floods had destroyed the city. And he made the first blockbuster. And I think, to my eternal sorrow, it looked like it worked. People flooded in, they lined up, they started paying tickets, and suddenly the gospel became, we have to do these blockbuster exhibitions. We have to get punters back in the museum. Now, what they didn't notice is that people went to the blockbusters. Yeah? They do what I call the Vermeer shuffle. You know, we go to museum exhibitions, we do this Vermeer shuffle. 6 seconds, you know, it was just, yeah, well, I've come to see the exhibition. Well, yeah, that's what we do. And this is supposed to be what's happening in museums. Museum directors, like me, are under pressure from my Minister of Culture, from the press. more numbers, bigger numbers, get those crowds. But I know that in fact, that's killing the museum. In effect, we're basically selling people a lie. We are suggesting, we museum people, we know that when you're alone with a Caravaggio, you're the only one there, the museum's closed, because you're a director, you can be there. That's when the work is speaking to you. That's when you can use your mind to engage with the piece. Is that what we're offering? No. Instead, we have this quantity of people going by, and our politicians want us to believe that art is just radioactive. You just shuffle. I was trying to think of what a REM, you know, the unit of radioactivity is a REM. I was wondering what the equivalent was for culture. You just pass people in front, expose them to a Vermeer for enough time, and somehow they go away more cultured. Wow, they're contaminated by art. And we know this is not true. And I think we are, all of us, complicit in this lie. My minister would probably be, I will probably get a text after he sees this on social media, because he'll say, we want numbers. I mean, he's convinced that numbers are good. Why? Because it drives tourism dollars. Museums are there for tourism. This, I think, is a nonsense. Museums are not there for tourism any more than good hospitals are in a country to encourage inward investment. It may be a desirable and positive result, but it sure as heck cannot be the reason we're making museums. I'll finish with that. So what we're really looking at is we need to increase the quality of engagement with the art. Now that could include mobiles. I'm not excluding digital. I'm just saying we have to think of, let's keep our eyes on the ball. The ball isn't numbers. Numbers can't be your goal. Your goal is that the art can transform, that something can happen to you that transforms. Now, I just took over as a part of a massive rethink of the Italian cultural system. The Italian Ministry of Culture is essentially highly Soviet. It still is, very top-down. But in a fit of unintended genius, my former mayor, Matteo Renzi, fired 20 museum directors and then did an international competition to hire another 20, of which I ended up being one of the 7 demon foreigners, now at the helm of Italy's largest museums. So this involved also what you could call a Copernican revolution, because for 40 years, the point of a museum in Italy, they didn't even exist. They didn't have their own budgets. You couldn't give money to them. They didn't take their own tickets in. They were large sheds, and the goal of the museum was to take care of the object, something called la tutela, conservation. Now, if your goal is taking care of the object, it's a very good thing. You can't transform people if the object is not in good shape. But it means that you don't have to ever think of who looks at it. So we've gone through a Copernican revolution now to say, well, we actually have to create value with these objects. And that doesn't mean tourist dollars. That means new value for new publics, for families, for children, for patients with Alzheimer's. But we've got to move from a world in which we sit in the center around the object and a world where we decide that the visitor's experience, their transformation, their change is our focus. So after the 100 days of consultation, when I got to Brera, obviously I started listening to people, starting with my guards. I discovered that I have more PhDs among the guards on my staff than I have among my art historians. Very paradoxical situation at Brera. And we decided to have a really simple mission. We're going to put Brera back in the heart of the city, because in 1975, the Ministry of Culture took all the power over to Rome, and the museums became just sort of these appendages. These reforms have allowed us to put the museum back in the heart of the city, and we wanted to put the visitor back in the heart of the museum. What does it mean to put the museum back in the heart of the city? It's really banal, okay? Let's talk about something that everybody else except Italy has. On banners on the outside of your building to say what's inside, like rocket science. This is a revolution. In Italy, it is a revolution. We were the first museum to put these banners up. We put new electronic signage up. We put new entry. We reopened the entry. We did a whole new, we started to recognize that we have visitors. Now, Italian museums are notorious for not recognizing they have visitors. We also changed the opening hours. Every Thursday we're open until 11 o'clock at night, and every third Thursday we have young musicians playing in all the rooms in the exhibitions. Young musicians in jeans playing Beethoven. It's sort of the same thing as saying, why is Caravaggio relevant? Well, Caravaggio is still a contemporary artist. In fact, he's one of the most radical contemporary artists that I can think of. Perhaps Picasso would be included. So you've got young kids saying, why is it radical to play Beethoven? It's really quite interesting. And then, of course, we decided to transform the 38 rooms of the exhibition. We decided to tackle the feeling of being in a museum. Because remember, if a museum is its collection, well, we're already the second best museum in the country. We've got Mantegna, we've got Bellini, we've got Veronese, we've got Caravaggio, we've got Tintoretto, we've got everybody, Raffaello, Piero della Francesca. But the problem is people confuse the quality of a collection with the quality of the museum. We have a world-class collection, the envy of the planet, and the museum is a dump. Now that's got to change. So in the spirit of it not being school, however, it's a place where you have to nobody failed a museum, where you can do what you want to do. The only condition, cybernetically speaking, only condition for museum attendance is wanting to go to the museum, right? There's no tests. So actually, if somebody remembers their first kiss in a museum, I think there's a major battle there. There's somebody who will never forget that museum or that piece of art for the rest of their life. This is a good thing. So our real goal in museums is to basically get away from the shuffle and get people to look at art longer, and most importantly, get more out of it, to see more in it. And that's the key to any real museum challenge. And that's what we're trying to do in Milan right now. So that involves reinstalling 38 of the exhibition rooms, which we're doing. We're just finishing the 24th room on the 5th of June. Now, the strategy we were advised from the top, as I said, I'm under a lot of pressure to build numbers. So they said, well, do exhibitions, do temporary exhibitions, do blockbusters, Mantegna and his world, whatever. And I said, no. Exhibitions are not the answer because exhibitions bring people to exhibitions. But if you actually sieve out the numbers, the people going to the museum, its permanent collection, are still falling. So we decided to do something a little odd. And you'll have to forgive me as a pun in English. I decided not to do exhibitions, but to do inhibitions. We're going to do inhibitions. What does that mean? That means bringing in 1, 2, 5 works, putting them together with our own collection in an experience that can only be there at the museum. It can't be traveled around the world. And so we started last year with our first inhibition, which, for those of you who have studied art history, this particular comparison between Perugino, his Marriage of the Virgin, and Raphael is in every single art history book. It has never, in the history of the universe, been done until last year in March. That, to put those two paintings together, and to move from basically the way the museum looked, 1950, to that, is for Brera a big step forward. The second inhibition was to bring in 2 dead Christs. We have Mantegna's Dead Christ, arguably one of the masterpieces of the Renaissance, first experiment in perspective used on a human being seen from the feet. We brought in 2 other dead Christs to put beside it, and again, we changed the way things looked. More emotion, more passion, more connection. Caravaggio was next. More stuff, more juice. We also decided to talk about museums, because most people think museums are just a place to show stuff, right? Joseph Veach Noble said in 1970 that the museum hand has 5 fingers: to collect, preserve, study, interpret, and exhibit. Only one of the fingers is showing stuff. So we decided to make the rest of the museum visible. We have an open restoration lab, open to the public. It's glassed in, designed by Ettore Sozzas. We have 2 open storage spaces, because everybody thinks we keep masterpieces in the basement, in the damp. It's not true. That's an urban legend. But fundamentally, we also opened up new voices. We wanted to break down the tyranny of the expert voice in the exhibition. So we started to ask other people to reread the works for us. We would invite poets, we would invite writers, we invited other people to say something about the art, because it's not really fair that only astronomers talk to us about stars, right? We sort of let poets do that too. We're inviting families into the exhibition. We have a special kit where you have activities for every level of families, from 3-year-olds to 6-year-olds to 9-year-olds, because the tradition is that family visits abort after 60% of the normal time because one of the kids is pissed off, right? The 3-year-old's crying, they're bored, the 9-year-old's running around. Anyway, so we create ways of experiencing the museum as a family because, to take a lead from the number 2 David, I think, it was this idea of creating relationships in the museum is fundamental, which we do and we reinforce by a whole strategy of labeling. We have curatorial labels, which aren't even written by the curators because no curators can write well. So they're written with the curators by decent writers. We have family and children's labels that are written specifically not for children to read, but for families to say things about the painting and get kids to look at paintings differently and to create a new relationship with them. And we also have labels written by famous authors. Orhan Pamuk is writing a label now about our big Bellini. We've had Ali Smith, we've had Sarah Dunant, we have great, great writers writing for us. And we also have a great team. You can't ever do the work without the team. That's what I was saying. This is gardening for you here. These are our guards, right? Of which 2 of them there have PhDs. And they're the guards that meet you, and they talk to you, and they're there, and they're identified by these new Trussardi scarves that we had made. Because, in fact, the guards, by the way, are heavily unionized, and for a long while they're very resistant to the demon management, the direction imposing terrible things on them, like uniforms. We're not going to wear a uniform. Okay, fine. What about a scarf that makes you look really good? Bingo. And now, bingo, right? And now the curious thing is, of course, they still don't really wear uniforms. It still looks a bit like a hippie commune sometimes. But the men don't wear scarves. Dilemma. Well, waistcoats, what do you do? By law, every person who works in the museum has to wear a badge. So now all the badges are in the color of the scarf. And so if you see those colors, you know that it's one of us. When I go into the exhibition floor, I have my own badge now, which the guards I always laugh at because, of course, they know who I am. But I wear the badge too because, in a way, I'm one of them, in a very big way. The other part of going back to putting the museum back in the middle of the city is for every single opening of our new Inhibitions, of which we're now into our 5th, before we open for previews. We do something for the people who helped us. So we do a preview for all our friends, the friends of Brera. We do special previews every single time. We invite all the city's taxi drivers for a private preview before the show opens. We invite all the city's concierge, and we invite all the city's tourist guides. Because you have to understand that people don't drop into a museum from Mars. They wake up in the morning, they have a coffee, they might read the paper, say, gee, well, let's go to the museum today. Yeah, oh, that's really boring. Well, no, they say something's up, so, well, they get their coffee, they have to take a bus. So we, of course, are working with to decorate the buses. We have 2 trams that go around with, say, take me to Brera. You take a taxi. When you come to the airport, when I go to an airport, the first person I talk to is a taxi driver. Who are the people in the chain that have to love and have to feel part of the project? Because branding isn't branding. It's nothing about logos. It's nothing about images. It's not swooshes. When you're creating a brand is a series of promises that you keep over time. That's all it is. It's no more. And a brand is creating a culture because everybody has to understand the promises you're trying to keep and see themselves as being in the same boat. And they can, even if they have different ideas, because a conservator or a restorer, a guard, an educator, they all have different senses of who we are or who you are as a museum. But they all have to share something so they all move in the same direction. So in fact, we do this thing. This Fiera de Brera means proud of Brera. And this is the T-shirt and our button we give to the taxi drivers. I see I have 1 minute and 32 seconds left. So I want to turn back to museums and why I have an allergy to thinking of their goals as solely a driver of tourism, as solely a kind of leisure industry, as solely something we do because we're too bored to do something else. When I lived in Frankfurt, when I was director of the Applied Arts Museum there, Frankfurt had a large immigrant community of Turkish people who came in the 50s and they're Gastarbeiter. And when I talked to them, because often they were taxi drivers who I also invited, they would tell me about taking 2 suitcases 2 suitcases. And that's all they brought. And what they put in it wasn't gold bars. They had photos, pictures of their grandparents, stuff that was precious. Now, there's a big debate about immigration these days, and we forget, though, that we're all, in some way, we're all immigrants. But not necessarily geographically. You might have been born 10 miles from here. But we're all immigrants in time, and we're going forward into a very uncertain future. Where do we pack our bags? What do we put in our bags that makes us us, that makes us the people we are, that allows us to share with other people the values we have? In the museum is one of the places you go to pack your bags. I'm me because I carry Caravaggio with me. A museum is a museum because it's where we go to at least find part of who we are and take it to the future. And that is an argument that has nothing to do with tourism and everything to do with who we are. Thank you.